Hi everyone, this is a lecture to review the stages of group, look a little bit more into group process and therapeutic forces. So all groups go through stages, the beginning, the working stage, and closing. So if you reflect on even our first week together, the beginning stage is reflective of people getting to know one another, high anxiety, trying to figure out what type of group experience this might be. The working stage is where, if a group is in the working stage, you almost don't have to facilitate the group. The group will facilitate itself. People are engaged, they're motivated, they want to do the work. Um, this is the stage sometimes where you can see some conflict, but the conflict can be used as a way to deepen your focus within the working stage. Having members, use I statements and work on their active and listening skills with each other around the topic is an important part of the group process. And the closing stage, it's important that we intentionally put effort into thinking about how to close a group. Most of our clients, or let me say not most, many of our clients have had difficult endings in their life. And so it's important that we intentionally close the group, give everybody a good experience with closure. And as you've probably seen in the video from last week, there are different models to represent the different stages of group. Corey with formation, orientation, transition, working, consolidation, and follow-up. And Tuckman is probably the most popularly cited sequential model. So forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And it's really just to say that in the beginning of the group, people are anxious, they don't know what to expect. It's good if we can give a lot of structure and, a lot of active directive interventions because ambiguity and lack of structure can create more anxiety. It's completely typical for group members to have some conflict with each other as they move into the, what Tuckman calls norming, but it could also be called the working stage of group. And that those conflicts can actually help to deepen the focus. And then again, here you have adjourning, so paying attention to closing of group. And group process is really just looking at the interactions and the exchange among group members and the leader in the here and now while in the group process. So if we are in a group process and I am talking with a group of people about how they deal with stress, well, what they're talking about is stress. That's the content. But how they're talking about it, who speaks up in the group when and to who, is part of the group process. And that kind of information will help you to be a better facilitator. So we're really paying attention to multiple experiences in the moment when we're facilitating group. What's really important is just establishing norms as we did during our first group together. So, if it's an educational group, we want to be clear with our group members that this is an educational group, and that is guiding the way that we're developing the group process. I bring this up because I recognized in my own clinical practice that a lot of therapists do not always begin with talking about what kind of group they're offering and what the assumptions are that they're working off of based on the kind of group they're offering. And that can lead to confusion because if the client has previously only experienced psychodynamic or process-oriented groups, and now they're in a setting where they're going to be focused on groups that are educational or based in learning theory, they may be confused as to what their role is within the group and what therapy is within this context. So we just want to make sure we're clear about defining what the assumptions are for our group process. When we're thinking about educational groups, I just want to highlight that it's important. I often see within educational groups or task groups a focus on using worksheets. Worksheets are great. I use them all the time, but we want to be aware of the fact that, members are coming with different learning abilities. For many, school has been a place of trauma and anxiety. And so we just want to be aware of that might be present or most likely is within the group. So for example, I always read worksheets to my group if that is, if I'm using a worksheet within the group process more than one time, recognizing that some people might need more time to process the information. That's just one example of being aware of different abilities within your group. Within a discussion group, the leader needs to be aware of not always trying to dominate. And this can be really hard to do because, as you're facilitating, you're kind of summarizing, you're clarifying, you're pulling in all the main points. And so it can be really easy to put the focus on yourself. And people want good leadership. When people, I think there's some fear about really kind of taking the reins and owning one's leadership, as owning that one is a leader within their leadership role. And group members are looking for that. So I encourage you to sort of really own that piece, but just be aware to not really dominate the conversation. When I dominate, I just point it out because I want to be role modeling behavior the entire time. So I'll just say to the group, hey, y'all, I've recognized I've been taking up a lot of your space right now. Let me, just take a moment and offer you this question and then sit back for a minute. I'd love to hear from everybody. Task groups are almost always going to have some conflict because everybody's got an idea about what the right answer is to solving a problem, which is typically when task groups are formed. And so it's important to, again, remember that groups don't go south or don't go bad, so to speak, when they have good structure in place. So when I'm running a task group, I always make sure to be clear about how we're going to communicate with each other, whether that's raising hands or you have to hold a special object or you have to be called upon. Whatever that is, I establish how people are going to share so no one can dominate. And if we get into, places where people's ideas are rubbing against each other, there's also a process in place for working through conflict, which might be creating a subcommittee to look into whatever the conflict is in more detail, or finding multiple ways in which the problem can be addressed where the conflict has arisen. Growth and experiential groups, it's just really important that we remember to offer, a place for people to share. This is where growth and experiential groups tend to be more process or psychodynamically oriented. And so in this role, again, you're facilitating and asking good questions, but there's not a lot of structure actually. And the group is kind of running itself. Again, as long as you're informing everyone from the beginning what the norms are of the group, you'll maintain safety throughout the process. Support groups are great. I know, beyond sort of groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or, groups for, gosh, there's so many groups out there, people who are experiencing grief or depression. It's good for support groups to be run by someone who's had that experience. Like for example, a lot of the places that I work have alumni support groups. And so, if someone's been involved in a therapy group for a long time, then we can also give them an opportunity to take on a leadership role and perhaps run a support group for, past alumni from similar therapy groups. In counseling and therapy groups, there tends to be a pretty wide variety of mental health need. It's not uncommon for counselors working in inpatient settings to have clients who, might be in active psychosis and not really aware of what's going on around them, and also people beginning to ground as some of their meds and other therapies begin to work. And so we have to just be intentional about the kind of intervention that we might use, and that there be enough flexibility with that intervention that someone with lower cognitive functioning can still get something out of the group experience. So this is where I often, when there's really a large spectrum of cognitive ability, this is where I tend to bring in the arts because it's easier to address, to provide an intervention that will meet the needs of all members, and yet I can still individualize. So if someone can think abstractly, they can represent their struggle. Let's say I'm running a therapy group for people who have bipolar disorder in an inpatient setting. And so if that individual has, is high functioning, I might ask them to, draw some things around that experience that are symbolic because they have the cognitive ability to understand what that means. And if I have someone maybe who's in active psychosis, I might just ask them to say, tell me what it's like for you right now to be experiencing, bipolar disorder, maybe through your favorite superheroes, or I might have some printed out images that they can just pick up and collage with. So this is just one example of being able to meet the very many different levels of mental health within the group. This is also just to say that there's no way that you're going to meet all the needs of all your group members all the time, and that's okay. A group is about recognizing that, we can prioritize some over the other at different times, and that's part of the learning process. Again, we over me. Self-help groups don't have any identified leader, and can be very helpful and also can be sporadic at times, is what I would say, because while there is no identified leader, if there isn't an individual kind of coming together to get the announcement out, hold the space for other people at the very least, it can make the group, it can stall the group process. So here we have Yalom's curative factors, and Yalom did this research in the 50s and 60s, and it's still very relevant to this day. And his curative factors are just to say that there are some elements of the group process that regardless of the type of group that you have, you can have some of these experiences no matter what. So first off, installation of hope is just that, by being in a group with other members, I know that I have other choices available to me. I'm not as stuck as I think I am. I'm thinking about a group for parents who have lost children. It can be, it can help them to develop hope that they can continue on by being with other survivors. There is universality, right? So I can see that, if I'm in a group for women with post-traumatic stress disorder, that there are, similar experiences that we've all had, and there's validation in that experience. We get to impart information. There's usually education provided not only from the leader, but from others in the group. Hey, here are some resources that I've tried that have worked for me when these other ones have not. This is where I find the group to be really supportive. Altruism and, just corrective, here, let me see if I can say this right, corrective recapitalization of the primary family group. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that quite correctly, but it really is just a fancy way of saying that the group experience can help somebody grow from and correct early childhood experiences, early family experiences. Some more of the curative factors, groups are great because they can help clients to practice socialization skills. I found that to be really important with substance abuse clients. They can develop an identity around their use and abuse of substances, and they need to practice how to socialize without substances. And so groups can provide a platform for that. We get to imitate behavior. It's why I'm always aware of how I'm modeling within a group experience, because I know that my group members are going to often in the beginning of their process copy my behavior and copy other people's behavior in the group. We get to practice interpersonal skills and the experience of feeling group cohesion. Again, there's nothing I think more important than feeling like you belong somewhere. Catharsis, growing, letting go of, feeling free. And existential factors, what is the meaning of my life? Um, all of this, what is the meaning of death? All of that, all of those existential factors, all of this can be experienced just from being in a group, period. It really, I have found, doesn't kind of matter what kind of group you have. If you have a good working group, all of these factors are present. And so again, just a reminder that we're always paying attention to our purpose of the group and making sure that it is relevant. We're not getting too off task. The ideal group size is 5 to 8 members, and yet you're probably not going to run groups that small. That's always ideal, and when you're in private practice, that's what I would encourage you to keep it to. But in a community mental health setting, I would say 10 to 15 is much more the norm. It's probably too big to really do good group therapy, which is often why they become more psychoeducational in nature. And as you can see here, educational groups can be larger. The length of the session can really depend. I think a good group typically isn't really more than 1 to 2 hours. Unfortunately, most intensive outpatient groups are 3 hours, but I find that most group members cannot really tolerate that long just sitting and talking with each other. And that's where I make sure there's plenty of breaks and we're getting up and moving together because it is hard to sit for that long. But discussion and education groups are typically 1.5 to 2 hours long. And that the exception for that is with children, where a typical session might be really, I would say, more around 20 to 30 minutes than 40 minutes. Children and adolescents are very focused on the here and now. They're not quite yet lost in their ruminations. So a shorter period of time is, not only because that's as long as they can focus, but that's really as long as you can keep everybody engaged in a group process too. Now this says therapy groups might be 1.5 to 2 hours. When I run therapy groups, I think there tends to be a little bit more of a spectrum. So, for example, like I'll run intensive groups over a weekend that are 8 hours long each day. So I think there's a lot of variation depending on the format. And depending on your where you're meeting, what type of group you have, will influence how often you're meeting. In residential settings, so inpatient, clients have daily groups. Some of my supervisees on average run about 3, sometimes up to 5 groups a day. So there's a lot of groups going on in an inpatient setting. Weekly groups are typical of outpatient care, and if you see something like partial hospital would be clients going in every day from 9 to 5. Intensive outpatient therapy would be, from, let's say, 6 to 9, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then typically groups that are process groups or psychoeducational groups, they're about 1 or 1.5 hours once a week. You do see some biweekly groups, but those tend to be the alumni support groups. I haven't seen actually within community mental health a lot of biweekly groups. And, of course, we want to make sure that the setting is well lit, the chairs are comfortable. You want to make sure, your group is sitting in a circle, ideally, of course, in a private space. The truth is that we sometimes need to run group wherever we can. I've done group in a basement, in a kitchen, outside. You just really never know where you're going to unfortunately end up doing group. So you just need to be flexible and, don't use an intervention that, might compromise somebody's confidentiality if you're in a more public space. After lunch is often difficult. I try to get my group members up and moving, do some stretching, some mindful movement, so that we can stay energized. And without a doubt, the energy that you bring to the group is the energy that people are going to bring to the group experience. So there are closed groups and open groups. Open groups are definitely more challenging. This is where somebody's coming in and out of the group at any time. Very common within substance abuse settings. So members do leave. Members can't get as close. I'm not sure I totally agree with that. Your author here feels that way. I think it is more challenging, but if you're really providing a space for authenticity within the group and you have members that are appropriate for group, remember that not everybody's appropriate for group, then group members can still get pretty close. It can be very difficult to work in a non-voluntary setting, and this is where I tend to use more of an active and directive approach, more high structure to keep people involved. So we want to think about, where is the level of commitment for folks in the group? What stage of change are they in? Are they ready to make change? Are they thinking about change? Are they committing change? All of that will influence, how I am facilitating the group. Because if they need a lot of motivation, that might change the level of energy that I'm bringing that day. The other thing I just wanted to mention, because we're all human here, and counselors also have bad days, and I just want you to know that if your energy is low one day and the group energy might be low, that's okay. We're all human here, and you always have a chance to come back to the group the following day. So I just don't want you to get into a place of anxiety where you feel like, oh, I messed it up, I can't go back. And that's just not true. It's interesting to explore the members' attitudes towards you because that is often indicative of their early childhood experiences, with adult figures. And think about your experience in leading the group, what makes you comfortable. And it's very important that when you're doing co-leadership, that you take some time with that leader to decide who's going to, be facilitating what, because otherwise you can end up stepping on each other's toes. It's important in a group, regardless of what type of group you're running, that you balance the process and content. So the content is what is said in the group, right? So if I have a group of women who are working on reducing stress, that would be the content of the group. And then the process would be, how they're sharing with each other, who's sharing with who, how are they sharing, what's going on within the group relationships. And that's it for this lecture.